Hello, everyone. My name is Yawa Eading, and I am the program coordinator for the Enhancing Gender Equity program of the Africa Center. And you're listening to Better Than the Cure Preventing Intimate Partner Violence. This is a podcast that will feature a series of guests from different fields and areas, all with knowledge and expertise on intimate partner violence, its factors, its consequences, and its impacts specifically within the African, Black, and Caribbean community within Alberta. So without further ado, I'll introduce our first guest. We have Dr. Patrina Duhaney, who is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Calgary. And I'll let her talk a little bit more about herself before we jump into today's podcast.
Hi, folks. As Yawa said, my name is Dr. Patrina Duhaney. Within the Faculty of Social Work, we've been quite busy uh, looking at various institutional changes that we can make within the faculty. And so that has kept me quite busy with ensuring that we create space for Black students, Black staff, Black faculty members, inclusive spaces, equitable spaces, so that they feel a sense of belonging so that they can flourish while they're in the faculty, but also the broader university. In terms of my research area, I also look at Black women's experiences of victimization. So, Black women who have experienced domestic violence, but those who've actually been charged as well with using violence in their relationship. And certainly, violence is complex. It's not always physical, various forms of violence. And so, I complicate that in terms of the complexities of violence for Black women. Currently, I'm conducting a study that looks at domestic violence in Black communities, and I'm taking a whole community approach there, looking at ways in which we can engage Black communities in general, but also the ways in which we can engage Black men in eradicating domestic violence. And so it's a 4-year project. And so we are currently moving into our second year of that project. And so we are certainly talking to various individuals in Black communities to look at the ways in which they not only define domestic violence, but also how does domestic violence show up in Black communities? Um, what are some unique things that we need to know in terms of domestic violence, how it's understood, how it's addressed, but also how are ways in which we can eradicate domestic violence in Black communities. My other research area looks at the ways in which we can bring about changes in the criminal justice system. And so I'm doing some work there with judges, lawyers. I've done some work with the Calgary Police to inform their own anti-racism strategy. And so just to highlight some of the work that I'm doing, but certainly as we talk, some of the other research projects I have on the go might be weaved through the conversation.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Patrina, for that introduction. And that just goes to show you're the right person to have here with me today. So we'll just jump off the conversation here with a very kind of foundational understanding of gender relations. And I'll define it for ourselves and for
Mhm.
everybody, but I'd like you to go a little bit deeper into that. So gender relations broadly refers to the social relationships and distribution of power between men and women in the public and private sphere. But can you talk a little bit more about gender relations specific to the African, Black, and Caribbean communities within the diaspora, specifically in white Western countries, if you don't mind?
Mhm. Yeah, when I think of gender relationships, I think it's quite ingrained, from historic conceptualizations of gender relations to now. And so the ways in which folks were looking at the ways in which men and women and various genders interacted, that's informing how we look at gender relations now. And certainly we've made significant strides, but we have a significant way to go. So, how we've conceptualized gender relations historically has primarily been through a Eurocentric Western way of knowing, way of thinking, way of being. And so, within the African Black Caribbean communities, that is certainly informing how we engage with one another. And so just complicating gender relations. I mentioned the fact that it's deeply ingrained in society, and because there are certain norms and value system around gender relations, it certainly make things a bit more difficult because of those gender relation. Men, women, various genders are structured in certain ways,
Mhm.
or
Mhm.
even constructed in particular ways because of those gender relations. So women are supposed to behave a certain way. They're supposed to carry themselves a certain way. They're supposed to speak a certain way. They're supposed to act a certain way. And if they're not conforming to these feminine or femininity, then they are not within those constraints that society has placed on women. And the same thing with men. They're supposed to be more assertive. They're not supposed to talk about their emotions. They're supposed to keep things to themselves. And so, because of those different binary classifications, um, it oftentimes restricts folks and certainly creates conflicts in the
Mhm.
relationship. And so we also have that complicated with how cultures behave. And how culture, some cultural norms. So we have societal norms, we have cultural norms,
Right.
but we also have individual norms. And even within those different cultures, we have individuals who have
Mhm.
their ways of looking at how they're supposed to behave within their own assigned roles. And so we have these complexities of how people negotiate those different expectations, and even of what they have of themselves, but what society has of them, and also their own cultures. And so those are constantly at play. And so within African communities, Black communities, I'll, speak about that holistically, but with the caveat that there are nuances and differences within these
Right.
communities that we are told that, women are supposed to be home, they're supposed to look after the children
Mhm.
and so forth, and the men are the primary breadwinners. And I think, when we think of historically how Black men have been out of the home, and Black women did not have the same luxuries as white women, where they also had to work. Um, Black women have not always had the luxury of relying on Black men. And so, because they haven't had that luxury, they haven't been as dependent on
Mhm.
them as their white women counterparts. And so, that could cause some conflicts as well, and we're seeing that with the younger generation, where young folks are saying, I don't need a man. I don't need a man to do what I need to do. And even more so than the previous generations, I'm certainly seeing that with the younger generation, that they are more self-sufficient,
Mhm.
and they're told that they need to be more self-sufficient because men will let them down.
Mhm.
And I find that that creates even more strain
Right.
in relationships as well.
Thank you for that. And you mentioned the conflict and you mentioned how there's societal norms and cultural norms of how men and women should act specifically, within the African, Black, Caribbean communities. I wondered if you could kind of speak a little bit more on what actually happens, what the breakdown is if a woman, an African, Black, or Caribbean woman is not, taking care of the children, is not doing what she's supposed to do as a woman. What
Hmm.
are the consequences of that? Or conversely, a man not being the breadwinner, a man not providing financially, a man not being the head of his home, so to speak. What do those breakdowns and what are the consequences of gender norms that don't are not fulfilled essentially?
Yeah. I mean, it's quite difficult to be confined to those restrictive binaries and those categories of how each gender is supposed to behave, because the ways we are moving through society, it's quite difficult. So, for instance, with economy, just how people are financially. It's difficult for one person to stay home while the other person goes out and works. So,
Mhm.
oftentimes you see families where two individuals have to be working to ensure that the family is financially stable. However, women, we have, the term is often used, the double shift, where women have not only had to go out of the house to work, but they're expected to work in the home. And it's not, the same expectation is not always given to men, where they should, work just as much to look after the children, look after the household, look after the finances. So that creates extra burden for women. And they're expected to know to do that, right? Not only are they supposed to be nurturers, they are expected to work out of the home and work in the home and make sure everything is running smoothly for everyone. And so, I mean, certainly that creates a significant amount of strain. And so, for Black men who do not conform or, stay within those binaries, some Black men are more nurturing, and so that might be frowned upon, that he should be out hustling, working for his family. And if he's not working for his family, then he's no good. And that's problematic. And so when a Black man is being measured to other Black men or even to white men who might not have the same barriers and obstacles, it creates even more conflicts in the home.
And
Yeah.
how do we see these conflicts manifest? Because especially when we talk about intimate partner violence, we find that people only think of, just the physical, the
Mm-hmm.
bruises, the
Mm-hmm.
black eyes. But what are the actual manifestations of these conflicts? How does it start? How does it escalate?
Mm-hmm.
What are the different dimensions? Because I believe it's on a spectrum of different
Mm-hmm.
things, the mental, emotional,
Mm-hmm.
physical. So can you talk a little bit about how these conflicts manifest from maybe the most kind of less extreme to the more extreme cases, at least that
Mhm.
you've seen?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly subtle. It oftentimes start out really subtle, where one partner might say to the other partner, like, "Why didn't you do that? Like, I thought you were gonna get the chores done. Why are the children's lunch is not made? How come the house is not clean? Why is my food not ready when I get home?" And so that may seem subtle,
Mm-hmm.
but over time you see things escalating where it's creating those arguments, right? Where there's name calling, where there are put downs, where there are comparisons are being made.
Mm-hmm.
How come this woman is doing this for her husband, but you can't get it together and figure things out and do that for our family?
Mm-hmm.
And so, the minimization, the lack of appreciation, and so forth. And so, even within the home, and I'm looking at it both ways. The woman might say to her partner, "How come you're not out bringing money home? And whatever you're bringing home is not enough. Obviously, we're not paying our bills. We're getting all these calls,
Mm-hmm.
and that's creating more stress for us. The kids don't have what they need to manage to survive in school, whether it's the clothes, whether the supplies, and so forth. And so it starts off quite subtle,
Mm-hmm.
right? But then it gets to the put downs, and the woman might be emasculating the man,
Mm-hmm.
that, look, I have to be the man.
Yeah.
I have to wear the pants in the household. Why are you not doing what you're supposed to do? And then, it might escalate into an argument where each person might become physical
Mm-hmm.
with the other person. Sometimes the police might get involved,
Mm-hmm.
depending on the extent of that violence.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Thank you. And you mentioned, especially with the younger generations, that sometimes, especially with girls or young women, that they feel that they no longer need a man, or
Mhm.
they're fulfilling both roles. And it just kind of speaks to the fact that gender norms and gender
Mhm.
roles are changing.
Mhm.
So I wanted to kind of ask, how can we make room or make space for these evolving gender roles while still holding on to cultural values and traditions that we immigrate here with, or that people come
Mhm.
here with, or people want to hold on to, despite how roles might change
Mhm.
as we kind of progress through time.
Mhm. Yeah. And when I think about how these roles have changed, I think there is a need for the changes to happen in terms of gender relations, because at one point women weren't even considered persons,
Mm-hmm.
right? So we, and women through the women's movement and so forth, feminism have, really had a place in so many homes to make sure that women have equal rights as men. We have a long way to go in terms of making sure that things are equitable. So I see that there's a need for that shift.
Mm-hmm.
But I also see a need for gender relations to be done in a way that is quite positive for the various genders and for people in general. That there's certain things that we need to hold on to, right? Whether it's one gender or the other being in the home, there has to be a shared responsibility to look after the kids.
Mm-hmm.
There has to be a shared responsibility to make sure that the financial needs of the family are met.
Mm-hmm.
There needs to be a responsibility to make sure that the children, the family is nurtured in different ways, whether it's spiritually, whether it's emotionally, physically, psychologically. So, I think what's really important is that there has to be continued conversations about what does that really look like
Mm-hmm.
at home, and how do we work through some of these nuances. How do we work through these pressures from society that our home should look a certain way, the way we interact with each other should look a certain way, how we parent should look a certain way? How do we work through those competing ask or responsibilities? Um, and so I think certainly conversations need to happen. Um, but I also don't believe that one person should or one gender should own all those
Mm-hmm.
responsibilities. And so I think there needs to be a shift in terms of how we look at those roles,
Right.
right? Why is it's a woman's responsibility to be the nurturer? Some women aren't nurturers,
Mm-hmm.
right? And they're quite content being out of the home, working, and so forth. And so we have to reimagine the expectations that we have of different genders. And some people don't even conform to those gender binary roles, right? And so that complicates things even more. And so, even what's more complicated is how different people's identities intersect. And so, gender relations are further complicated by people's intersecting
Right.
identities, right? Whether it's, if you have a disability, if you have mental health concerns, there are so many different ways in which those gender relationships are further complicated. And I think, creating a space for those ongoing dialogue are so important to manage those issues.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of these dialogues, 'cause sometimes it can be hard to address, especially intimate partner violence or
Hmm.
domestic abuse within African, Black, or Caribbean communities. So, how do you think, or what's the best way to get started on having these dialogues, having these conversations, and even beyond that? Because, dialogue and conversations are great,
Hmm.
but we need
Hmm.
action, we
Hmm.
need, implementations.
Hmm.
So, step by step, how do you best visualize this can happen, or what advice would you have for service providers, organizations, community leaders, spiritual leaders, anyone
Hmm.
in general to take the first step and to
Hmm.
go further than that to make
Hmm.
these changes happen?
Yeah, I mean, and certainly the first place is awareness. We
Mm-hmm.
need awareness so people um, are able to recognize what gender-based violence is,
I
intimate
agree.
partner violence. So, first off, we need awareness,
Mm-hmm.
okay? And although there's awareness, externally, I think there has to be more awareness in Black communities.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes, some Black communities might not believe that what is happening in society in terms of, domestic violence necessarily applies to them, because we tend to focus primarily on white families,
Mm-hmm.
right? A lot of the education, a lot of the initiatives are focused on primarily white individuals. And so, because of that, that creates some, resistance, for lack of a better word, or some barriers to seeking support, because for one, the services that are available are not catered to Black families oftentimes. The therapists oftentimes are not Black, they tend to be white most often. Even the intervention, the types of intervention that are there are not specific to Black families. And so, if we just unpack that a little bit, we look at awareness, but we also need to look at the ways in which domestic violence shows up in Black families. And so, oftentimes there's this code of silence.
Right.
And what I mean by code of silence is we don't talk about it, we don't tell anyone about our business,
Keep it quiet.
keep
Yeah.
it quiet, keep it quiet, and we need to keep it quiet because we're just going to have more problems if we share what's going on with people. And, just complicating that a little bit more is that that's tied to systemic barriers. Oftentimes, Black people have been harmed when people have come in to provide support, whether it's social workers, whether it's the police. And so they have experienced those challenges having people involved. They haven't felt that they've helped them. They've just felt that they've made their lives even worse. So there's a reason why there's that code of silence, but that code of silence is also harmful. It's harmful for Black women for seeking support when they have experienced domestic violence. It's harmful for Black men to seek support when they have been implicated in harming their partners or even knowing how to deal with those emotions that may come up. And so, because those conversations aren't happening, they're not seeking the necessary supports that they need. And so, I think, when we think of how we can address this on multiple levels, I always believe that within the home, conversations need to happen within the home. Within communities, we need to create spaces where communities take on the responsibility of addressing domestic violence head on. And so by that, I mean just being intentional. Yeah, we can no longer say that this is a private matter that's between a man and a woman or between individuals. It is something that we need to address head on so that we can find different different intervention, different tools, different approaches to addressing the issue. But I also think it's really important for different service providers to come together.
Right.
I oftentimes see these services are so siloed.
Yeah.
People
Everyone's
are
with it.
just
Yeah.
not talking. People are doing their own thing. And that makes it very difficult, for us to even know what services
Are out there.
specifically are out there for Black individuals that specifically look at Black individuals, that look at racial trauma.
100%.
Yeah, that look at the impact of racism. And so right now the standard approaches are the strengths-based approach, empowerment, CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, and so forth. And I'm like, those don't always they seldom take a racial trauma lens. And so, and intergenerational trauma, looking at intergenerational trauma. So the interventions need to look at the role of racial trauma. Interventions need to look at the role of intergenerational trauma, as well as the ways in which systemic barriers complicate those relationships or complicate experiences of intimate partner violence between individuals.
100%. And I like the fact that you mentioned silos working in the nonprofit sector.
Mm-hmm.
We also have people that want to partner up with us because, we're doing similar work and, it's like everybody's doing similar work. Everybody's doing the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it actually fragments the services. It makes it hard for people who actually need the services to find the right one that works for them or not, send them to different places to get the help they need. Because that's discouraging. You have to go here to get this and
Right.
go here to get this, or this doesn't have that. So I really like the fact that you mentioned, there needs to be more collaboration or a coalition or something that brings these service providers together. Something that you mentioned that I'd like to touch on is the systemic barriers that, our communities face when they want to talk about these issues, when they want to seek help, whether it's, with the police or, with the justice system, etc. And just to kind of paint a picture of how systemic, these issues
Mhm.
actually are, I would love for you to highlight that example of when you appeared in courts to kind of help with one of these cases. If you
Mhm.
don't mind just kind of painting that picture and putting into perspective, some of the thoughts or misconceptions about how people perceive African Black or
Mhm.
Caribbean cultures almost as a facilitator or, grounds for intimate partner violence or
Mhm.
domestic abuse to happen.
Mhm. Absolutely. And so, certainly when we look at the ways in which Black people are, implicated in these conversations, I think of stigma and
Mm-hmm.
I think of stereotypes. So there are stereotypes around how a Black woman is supposed to be, is supposed to behave, how Black males are. And so within my own research, within the scholarship, a common theme is that Black women are more aggressive. Black women are like to run their mouths off.
Mm-hmm.
They just emasculate men. They put men down. They're more likely to fight than their white women counterparts. Black men are more violent. They're just sperm donors.
Mm-hmm.
And they just don't care about their families. They just take off and leave their families. And so when we look at these different stereotypes that are constantly at play, whether it's within Black communities or it's external. So we have those stereotypes that are external to Black communities, but even within Black communities, Black people, some Black people feel the same
Yeah.
way, right? Or have the same negative stereotypes about Black individuals, right? And so, those really play out when it comes to seeking support. So, because of these negative stereotypes, a Black woman who's experiencing domestic violence might be reluctant to seek support or call the police when she's been abused for fear that the police may arrest the Black male, because oftentimes that's the case, or because of how the police may view her, they might arrest her
Mm-hmm.
and think, well, because you weren't crying, because you didn't appear to be this passive victim and helpless victim, you are implicated as much as your partner is.
Mm-hmm.
And so, not only does the Black woman have to worry about herself in terms of whether or not she may be charged, but she's also worrying about um, if her partner will be charged, how the community might view her, and especially if the person is connected to a religious institution, they're thinking about, what is my church going to think
Yeah.
about this? They're going to think that I locked up another Black male, and I'm, contributing to the stereotype that all these Black male are violent and they're behind bars. And so it's quite complex in terms of the burden that
Mm-hmm.
a woman has to make in terms of deciding whether or not to call the police for help or seeking support, because she has her own familial pieces to address, but also the culture that she's part of, and also societal stereotypes. But when it comes to culture, oftentimes culture is when people use culture is racialized. In other words, culture tends to be racialized, and when it sometimes it's other issues, but people use culture as a crutch.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's their culture. That's why they behave a certain way. And when people use the term culture as an explanation for behaviors, then that justifies the way they may treat that person.
Mm-hmm.
And so, for example, when you were talking about the incident involving a judge saying that, oh, have you seen it? The judge is asking me that question, where it's because of certain cultures. Certain cultures are just a certain way. And so I would say, no, that's highly problematic. Within cultures, we have a diversity of individuals. So we cannot blame a culture when individuals are engaging in certain behaviors. And so I see that people hold these stereotypes on multiple levels, whether it's in the police, whether it's in the court system, whether it's in the workplaces. And because of these So oftentimes erroneous assumptions. People are being treated a certain way because of these preconceived notions of how they are and how people like them behave.
Mm-hmm.
So certainly highly problematic.
Mm-hmm. And I think I want to shift the conversation a little because we always talk about, men and their relationship or their role in intimate partner violence. But I'd
Mhm.
like to kind of go deeper and to see how can we actually engage men and bring men to the forefront without, it being problematic. And one of the questions I have for you is, what are the common misconceptions that actually stop men or prevent men in the first place from engaging in the conversation or speaking up or standing with, domestic abuse victims, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah. Oftentimes, men are left out of the conversation, and even when we look at the women's rights movement and the domestic violence sector, men are the last people that are considered. It's always from the framework that women are victims; they need to be protected from men, and so with that narrative, men are oftentimes excluded, right? And because they've been excluded, men have not really understood their role
Mm-hmm.
in terms of addressing domestic violence, preventing domestic violence. And so the first piece is, I think, it's the ways in which we have socialized folks within society on their various roles. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so I think that's problematic that men have historically been excluded,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because they've been considered a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we were to, restory that narrative and for men to know that they have a valuable role in eradicating domestic violence, um, we need to shift the narrative. And so shifting the narrative starts even before we look at what's happening at the societal level. Shifting the narrative starts in the home.
Right.
And so, if I were to unpack that, I would say shifting the narrative means, letting little boys know this is what it looks like to be a little, a brother, a sibling. And as they grow up, this is what it looks like to be an uncle, and a son, and so forth. So they kind of see those positive role models as well in terms of what their role is and how they can contribute. And so what I'm pointing out is there has to be a preventative piece. It's
Mm-hmm.
not just about dealing with the issue when it comes up. Let's prevent domestic violence before it
100%.
happens, before we get to intervention, because we might not need all that intervention if we are
Prevent
doing
it to begin with,
as
yeah.
much as we can to prevent it, right? And so, getting men involved, getting little boys involved, getting young, teenagers involved from a very young age in different initiatives
Mm-hmm.
involving women, letting them know what their role is and how they can, play a really unique role. And so, there is certainly ample research there that shows that when men are involved in domestic violence interventions or advocating on behalf of women, those organizations tend to be a lot more successful
Wow.
when men are at the forefront leading that cause. So that is certainly positive in terms of knowing that men can play a significant role. And, historically, men aren't, most men don't endorse that we should beat up on women.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't necessarily endorse that we should treat women unfairly. I think what happens is that sometimes they don't even know how to be supportive or even know how to advance a cause
Mm-hmm.
because they haven't been taught. So I think it's important for men to know how they can be involved. And I also believe there's a role for other men to educate other men, because there's certain things that I can do as a woman, but it would be received differently if a man,
If it came from a
yeah, if
man,
it came
yeah.
from another male. And so I even see this in my own home that although I might say something to my son, if his father were to say the same thing to him, it's received differently,
Yeah.
right? So I think men helping other men,
Mm-hmm.
there's a room for that. Certain spaces, women don't need to be in there because they just don't get it,
Yes.
you know? And so there's that gender component where men have to support men.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
100%. And I love how you touched on, we can start at the top with society or with these institutions and with these organizations, but I think the most impactful, the most effective way is actually to start within the home, whether it's showing, little boys,
Mm-hmm.
how to relate to one another in their relationships,
Mm-hmm.
what gender roles, healthy gender roles actually look like, and not to, build their identity
Mm-hmm.
or define themselves or their worth based on, what it means to be a man, whether
Mm-hmm.
they're, good at being what society deems as,
Right.
because that's when you see those breakdowns and those
Right.
conflicts arise. And now intimate partner violence without giving them the coping mechanisms, giving them
Mm-hmm.
the tools, the strategies to actually navigate these gender
Mm-hmm.
relations. And,
Mm-hmm.
when maybe they feel they're falling short. So I really do love that. And I kind of
Mm-hmm.
wanted to, because we've talked on how, men can be involved and men can make a stand and,
Mm-hmm.
help advance the cause. But we also need to highlight the fact that there are men who do, enact these abusive behaviors. There
Right.
do men who
Right.
engage in intimate partner violence.
Mm-hmm.
And although we want to hold them accountable, we also do want to give them the space
Mm-hmm.
to change and the space to heal. So my question for you, essentially, is how can we create these spaces? How can we ensure that men, who are engaging in these problematic practices, whether it's abuse, physically, emotionally, financially, are held accountable, but also are given the space to change and to kind of shift their actions and their thoughts or their attitudes towards, gender relations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I can certainly reflect on my time working in a a shelter for abused women and their children. And I heard horrific stories.
Mm-hmm.
Women used to, provide horrific stories, accounts of their experiences with their abused partners, or their partners who were abusing them. And so certainly, I tend to look at things from a more restorative justice approach. And so there are certainly men that need to be incarcerated
Mm-hmm.
because what they do is so horrific to women. There are other times that men have just not been taught appropriate ways of dealing with conflicts,
Mm-hmm.
right? So they lack those interpersonal
A
skills, they
hundred
lack
percent.
those problem solving skills. And so oftentimes, when we look at the ways in which the criminal justice deals with domestic violence, yes, there is a need to hold men accountable for the harm that they have caused, but to criminalize men and criminalize women who engage in domestic violence, it could just be a shove. And I'm not minimizing that shove, but incarceration is not the answer,
Mm-hmm.
in other words. And so, what would be helpful is for us to look at different approaches um, instead of incarceration, because those approaches would be more
A
appropriate
hundred percent.
for dealing with some of these conflicts that happen in relationships. And as I mentioned, these conflicts are oftentimes compounded by external factors. It's not just what's happening within the relationship, it's compounded by external factors. And so if we're not addressing those external factors, how can we actually address what's going on in the
The root of the
relationship?
problem, exactly.
Yeah, so looking at all the various complexities that are weighing in on that relationship. And so I think as a society, we need to look at different approaches
Mm-hmm.
outside of the criminal justice system. And this is where the community comes in. The community also needs to take more ownership,
Mm-hmm.
right? These are the approaches that we have that are Afrocentric, that looks at racial justice, that look at racial trauma, intergenerational trauma. So I think as communities, as Black communities, we need to develop tools and share it
Mm-hmm.
so people know that these tools are available, that can support support Black individuals outside of the court system. And so, even with the work I'm doing for impact of race and cultural assessments, where I'm writing these reports for those accused of a crime, I'm always finding ways outside of the court system that we can engage with those who are accused of a crime, whether it's are there community programs that they can get
Mm-hmm.
involved in? Are there extracurricular stuff, community supports that they can access,
Right.
right? Because sometimes that's the intervention that's needed. But I also think it's important to not just deal with what's going on with the family, but what else is happening?
Mm-hmm.
Does the family need support as it relates to childcare?
Right.
Do they need support in terms of income,
Mm-hmm.
right? Financial support. And so until we deal with all those other factors that are putting a strain on the family system, uh, you know, dealing with those tensions will always be an issue.
Mm-hmm. And the fact that you mentioned, looking outside of the court system, outside of the justice system, because again, 100% incarceration is not the only answer. You don't put the man in prison and throw away the key and
Hmm.
hope the problem, resolves itself. Um, Relating to community, I think it's important that community partners with, service providers, partners with religious institutions, that everyone is working
Hmm.
together, even if you're from different sectors,
Hmm.
because there's support from each piece that can go a long way in
Hmm.
improving the outcomes of, the men in our community. In terms of what you mentioned with seeking other solutions, how effective or how difficult has that been, looking outside of the justice system, or these formal punishments? Has there been support for that? Do other people kind of understand the lens that you're coming from, and how can we kind of advance that further and get more people on board,
Hmm.
whether it's the community leaders, and say, hey, these men are from our community. um, are you able to take up more ownership? Has there been engagement? Has there been kind of buy-in from these people, kind of relating to what you said in terms of
Hmm.
these other solutions?
Yeah. And, making reference to the impact of race and cultural assessment, and those are called IRCAs. And so when I think of the ways in which Black communities have advocated for change, there has been some shift. And so the IRCA is part of that shift.
Mm-hmm.
Looking at the over criminalization of Black individuals in the criminal justice system, the over surveillance of Black individuals, and trying to push back against those systems that continue to oppress Black individuals. So I think as a community, we need to take ownership and to say, listen, we have these approaches that have proven effective. And so, as a researcher, I'm going to plug this for a moment that community organizations need to work with universities or researchers because they're the ones who are conducting the research. They're
Mm-hmm.
the ones who are considered experts in their field.
Mm-hmm.
And, oftentimes when there's data to show the effectiveness of a program, there is more buy-in.
Mm-hmm.
So we need data,
Yes.
right? And because if it stays within the organization, if it's just something they use when clients come to them and there's nothing on their website, they don't have information on it, there hasn't been any data in terms of the effectiveness, it's really hard to say to the courts that, hey, I have a program that might be effective here as opposed to what you're using, right? So I certainly believe that there's a need for organizations to ensure that they are collecting data
Mm-hmm.
and documenting this information in a public forum
Mm-hmm.
so people are aware. Because I must say, there might be tons of things that exist. It's just it's not documented
Right.
or it's not shared publicly. It's just within the organization. So people, again, aren't aware that these things exist. So I think organizations need to come together, Black organizations, but they might need to work with other more established organizations to say, hey, this is what we've done. This is how it's worked. These are the shortcomings, and
Mm-hmm.
this is how we're working through it.
100%.
Yeah.
Awesome. And As we kind of wrap up the conversation here, I wanted to ask, I love that you mentioned, communities partnering with researchers, because those publications or the data that's collected and then disseminated is actually a great way to implement policy change.
Mhm,
And
mhm,
all those policy changes have great benefits for the community members. So I think once community organizations and leaders and, the people directly involved understand that how data and policies in the best interest of all of us, then hopefully we can see an increase in these collaborations
mhm,
and future policy changes for our community, because again, we're the people that are affected by it.
mhm,
But again, to kind of wrap up here, and this has been a great conversation so far, how can we ensure that this conversation and conversations like these around intimate partner violence or domestic abuse within, African, Black, and Caribbean communities is ongoing, is sustainable, and that community members stay engaged in, these efforts and this program or this project or this attitude of wanting to change the narrative around how our communities face intimate partner violence?
mhm. Yeah. I know a lot of what we do is connected to funding.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And although it's connected to funding, it cannot be a one-off thing. So, for example, my project on domestic violence is a 4-year project. And so, what I'm doing tirelessly is building networks, building communities, making sure that I bring that awareness so folks know that there's this study that's happening and we want to hear your voices. So that's the first thing. We definitely need to make sure that what we're doing today, it's not a one-off conversation and nothing happens. And
Mm-hmm.
so the fact that we're even broadcasting this, I think that's an important thing. We are moving it beyond just four walls,
Mm-hmm.
and we are sharing that on different platforms. So I think that's really key, and even reaching different generations. There's so much on social media now. So we need to use different platforms to bring awareness. So that's another thing. So building those networks, working collaboratively is really, really important. Not having the one-off events, having multiple events throughout the year,
Mm-hmm.
having different events on multiple levels. So we need to go in the school systems,
Mm-hmm.
making sure that we have unique programs for Black youth. For Black kids, working with different universities, working with different organizations. So we need to do it on multiple levels. Speaking with government
Mm-hmm.
officials, right now, with the work I'm doing, I'm working on an advisory board for the ombudsman for victims. And so, whatever I glean from our communities, I'm sharing that with that board
That's
so that
amazing.
they can move it up the ladder,
Mm-hmm.
right? In terms of looking at how we can support Black communities. And so I think, for those of us who are in those positions, it's really important that we are bold and say, hey, what's missing here is that we're not looking at this issue through our racial justice lens.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in a recent meeting with this ombudsman advisory committee, and we're reviewing a government document, I'm like, I don't see a racial justice lens here. And we need to make sure that when we're talking about victims, we are explicitly looking at the ways in which Black individuals are uniquely impacted by domestic violence. And so sometimes we have to put ourselves out there. It
Mm-hmm.
might be uncomfortable, but this is what we need to do to strengthen our communities, bring more awareness that some of the experiences that we have are unique and it needs specific attention.
Mm-hmm.
And so those are some of the few things that we can do.
That's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And I know I said that was the last question, but I do have one more question for you
Mm-hmm.
as we wrap up today. Thank you so much for taking time to be here. So, how can other people that are listening to this, or perhaps, tuning in, connect with you or kind of keep up with the research and the work that you're doing?
Yes. So I am on LinkedIn. Folks can just search my first and my last name, Patrina Duhaney, Patrina, Duhaney, Duhaney. I'm at the university. It's hard to miss me. And so I'm in the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Calgary. And so folks can email me and they can also reach out to me on platforms. Yeah.
Awesome.
Hmm.
Awesome. Well, that is it for today. Again, thank you so much for taking your time, sharing your knowledge and your expertise. It's been a pleasure having you. And thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed. We've had Dr. Patrina Duhaney on here talking about gender relations and engaging men in the fight and efforts to stand against intimate partner violence in African, Black, and Caribbean communities within Alberta. So that is everything for today, and we hope to see you all next time.